Tonight, we're taking you inside the real stories behind every person executed in the United States in January and February of 2025. No fluff, no filler, just the facts that matter and the moments people can't forget. You'll hear what happened, how the cases moved through courts, what the final appeals tried to stop, and the last words spoken when time ran out. As we move, remember to tell us in the comments where you're watching from and which case hits you hardest, because this isn't just history, it's a debate that's still breathing. Did justice land where it needed to, or did it miss something that can't be fixed? First, a quick map for the journey ahead. We're covering 5 executions that opened 2025, each one different in motive, method, and aftermath. South Carolina, Texas, Alabama, and Florida, 4 states, 3 methods, 5 defendants, 5 victims' families who waited years to hear that it was over, and 5 sets of final words that either asked for grace, denied guilt, or said absolutely nothing. We will not slow down for dramatics. We will go straight to the record, crimes as charged, evidence relied upon, the verdicts that came back, the sentences handed down, the appeals that tried to shake them loose, and the precise moment the state carried them out. If you're new here, this is what we do. We examine the line where law, morality, and memory collide, and we do it with receipts. Before we step into the first case, lock in the framework that will hold all 5. Every story you'll hear follows the same spine. The crime that triggered an investigation. The trial that turned evidence into a verdict. The appeals that argued procedure, fairness, or evolving standards of punishment. The last meal that often says more than it seems. And the final statement that reveals what a person wants to leave behind when there's nothing left to win. That rhythm keeps us honest. It prevents cherry-picking. It keeps the emotional heat from rewriting the facts you need to judge for yourself. Why these months? Because the opening of a year often sets the tone for the national conversation on capital punishment. January and February 2025 were no exception. In that narrow window, we saw an execution by lethal injection in South Carolina, its first of the year and the first in the country. Texas carried out 2 lethal injections a week apart. Florida returned to its chamber, and Alabama used nitrogen hypoxia, a method that has ignited arguments across courtrooms and comment sections alike. Together, these cases form a cross-section of how different states enforce the ultimate sentence and how differently those final minutes can look, sound, and even taste. If you've watched our investigations before, you know we do not glorify the crime and we do not erase the victim. We will state the violence plainly, because the truth is not polite, but we will not linger on suffering just to squeeze tears. When we talk about last meals and last words, it's not for spectacle. It's because ritual matters. Ritual tells you who holds power, how a system tries to show dignity, where remorse is present and where denial stands its ground. A plate of food can be a prayer, a dare, or a shrug. A sentence of final words can be a confession, a protest, or silence that says, "You already made up your mind." You'll also notice a theme that repeats across these cases: childhoods that bent toward chaos, schools that failed to catch a falling kid, addictions that sharpened into criminal patterns, and early violence that predicts the next escalation. None of that excuses a murder. It does explain why, at sentencing, defense teams bring in the history, head injuries, trauma, learning disabilities, and juvenile records that grew into adult rap sheets. Prosecutors, on the other hand, bring the physical evidence, the eyewitnesses, the timeline that tightens like a noose, and the aggravating factors that move a case from life without parole to death. Between those poles, jurors sit with the worst day of someone's life and the last day of someone else's. Let's talk process for a moment, because the process is the story. A capital case doesn't end with a verdict. It stretches for years, sometimes decades, through state appeals, federal habeas petitions, and emergency applications in the final week, the final day, the final hour. Some arguments focus on guilt. Others attack the penalty phase. Still others challenge the method of execution itself. You'll hear how some lawyers pushed hard against lethal injection protocols, how others confronted nitrogen hypoxia, and how governors weigh clemency when the legal road is gone. You'll see where mercy is possible and where the law draws a hard line. You'll also hear about last meals and the rules that shape them. Some states still permit a request within a budget and kitchen capacity. Others serve the standard menu, no exceptions. What inmates choose, when they're allowed to choose, can read like nostalgia for a childhood kitchen, an indulgence they never had on the outside, or a simple utilitarian decision. I'm hungry. This will do. And then there are final statements, a microphone, a window, families watching, officials taking notes, a clock on the wall. Some speak with calm, some rage, some pray, some refuse. None get a second take. As we present the 5 cases, listen for the specific details that make each one different. A house fire that tried to erase evidence, a church office that became a crime scene in the middle of the day, a confession challenged as coerced across state lines, a toddler survivor who grew up in the shadow of 2 graves, a defendant who threatened a lawmaker from death row with a smuggled phone. These aren't headlines, they're the threads that pull juries, judges, and eventually executioners to the same conclusion. The sentence will be carried out. And while you listen, keep your own standard of justice front and center. Ask yourself, did the prosecution prove its case beyond a reasonable doubt, or did plea deals and jailhouse testimony tilt the scale? Did the defense present mitigation that should have persuaded at least one juror to choose life? Did the years of appeals cure the trial's defects, or did they just sand down the edges? When the method of execution itself is on trial, what do you make of the assurances that it is humane? And what do you make of eyewitness accounts that say otherwise? These questions are not academic. They are the oxygen of this debate. We aren't here to tell you what to think. We're here to make sure you have everything you need to think clearly. We are going to move quickly, but we will not rush past the moments that define a case. The words a witness said on the stand, the piece of evidence that anchored the narrative, the legal ruling that closed the last door, the food on the tray, the last breath. If you're ready for a sanitized version, this isn't it. If you're ready for a careful, relentless walk through the record, you're in the right place. So here's the deal. If you care about accountability, transparency, and the way a society uses its most severe punishment, stick with us to the end and use the comments like a courtroom. Cite your reasons. Challenge ours. Bring your perspective from wherever you're watching. Smash like if you value this kind of reporting, and subscribe so you don't miss the next investigation. Now, Part 2 begins with a name you'll remember. The first person executed in the United States in 2025. A case that started with a house fire and ended with a lethal injection. On January 31, 2025, the state of South Carolina carried out its first execution in more than a decade, and the first execution in the United States that year. The name at the center was Marion Bowman Jr., a 44-year-old man who had spent nearly 23 years on death row. His case began with a fire in a small town, a young woman dead inside her home, and investigators who quickly concluded that the blaze was no accident. What followed was a trial that turned a troubled local man into the face of a capital murder conviction, a 2-decade chain of appeals, and a final statement issued not from the execution gurney, but through a collection of poems. Let's rewind to February 17, 2001, in Branchville, South Carolina. The victim was Candy Louise Martin, a 21-year-old woman who lived with her young son. That night, Candy was killed in her own home, and the house set ablaze to disguise the crime. Fire investigators found evidence of arson, accelerant residue, and burn patterns that showed the fire had been started deliberately. Alongside that, detectives documented clear signs of a violent struggle before the flames. The small community was shaken. A mother gone, a child left behind, and a crime scene that suggested planning, not chance. Police attention soon focused on Marion Bowman Jr., then only 20 years old. Locals knew him as a young man often in trouble, with a reputation for dealing and using drugs. 2 names emerged alongside his, Travis Felder and James Gadsden, acquaintances who had been near the scene. Both eventually cut plea deals, But one of them, Gadsden, would become the linchpin of the state's case. Gadsden testified under oath that Bowman was the one who killed Candy and set the fire. To back him up, prosecutors pointed to a gun recovered during the investigation. They said it was Bowman's, and that it was used to commit the murder. Bowman's defense was simple, but absolute. I didn't kill her. He claimed the weapon was planted and that Gadsden only testified against him to save his own skin. His attorneys reminded the jury of his upbringing, a family wrecked by alcoholism, a boy drinking by age 10, selling drugs before he could drive, and living in cycles of neglect. They hoped jurors might choose life without parole over death, even if they believed the verdict would be guilty. But in the courtroom at St. George, South Carolina, in May 2002, the momentum swung hard the other way. Prosecutor Walter Bailey told jurors the crime was cruel, calculated, and deserving of the harshest punishment available. After just 3 hours of deliberation, the jury convicted Bowman of murder and third-degree arson. The sentence, death for the murder charge and 10 years for arson. The co-defendants received far lighter outcomes. Felder walked away with probation. Gadsden, the state's witness, received 20 years. Bowman went to death row, beginning a legal odyssey that would stretch across state and federal courts for more than 2 decades. His appeals argued everything from unreliable testimony to claims that South Carolina's execution methods, the electric chair and firing squad, were unconstitutional. At times, he joined class-action lawsuits aimed at halting executions statewide. Each time, the courts responded the same way. The conviction and the sentence stand. When his final date was set, Bowman's attorneys shifted to clemency pleas. They asked the governor to consider his background, his insistence on innocence, and the reliability of the state's key witness. The governor declined. The clock kept ticking. As the day approached, Bowman was given the chance to order a last meal. He didn't hold back. The tray included fried shrimp, fish, oysters, chicken wings, chicken tenders, onion rings, banana pudding, German chocolate cake, pineapple juice, and cranberry juice. For his last words, Bowman chose not to face the witnesses with a spoken statement. Instead, he released a message through a book of poems he had written while incarcerated. In those pages, he admitted to a relationship with Candy and to selling her drugs, but he continued to deny the charge of murder. He framed himself as wrongfully convicted, insisting the truth would one day be revealed. At 6:27 p.m. on January 31, 2025, executioners at Broad River Correctional Institution administered a lethal dose of pentobarbital. Witnesses reported that Bowman looked toward his attorney, closed his eyes, took heavy breaths, and then went still. The first execution in America that year was over. The case of Marion Bowman, Jr. is one that still divides opinion. To some, the conviction was airtight. Physical evidence, a cooperating witness, a jury that reached a decision in hours. To others, the reliance on a co-defendant's testimony and the possibility of a planted gun raise questions that can never be answered now. What's certain is this: a young woman was killed, her home set on fire, and 2 decades later, the state carried out the maximum penalty against the man they said was responsible. Now, with that first execution behind us, the timeline moves west to Texas, where just 5 days later another name, another life, and another set of final words would define the second execution of 2025. On February 5, 2025, Texas carried out its first execution of the year at the Huntsville unit, the same chamber that has seen more executions than any other in the United States. The name was Stephen Loyne Nelson, age 37, just shy of his 38th birthday. His crime had haunted a church congregation for over a decade, and his life story was one of abuse, volatility, and violence that escalated until the state said enough. Let's go back to March 3, 2011. Arlington, Texas. Inside the North Point Baptist Church, 2 people were at work: Pastor Clint Dobson, age 28, and Church Secretary Judy Elliott, 69 years old. Nelson entered that building with the intent to rob, but what happened next pushed him past theft into a level of brutality that shocked even seasoned police. Pastor Dobson was beaten, strangled with a computer cord, and suffocated with a plastic bag. Judy Elliott was savagely attacked as well, her face and body crushed by blows, her life barely spared. Nelson left believing both victims were dead. Dobson never got back up. Elliott somehow did. She survived, though only after a heart attack, months of surgeries, and metal plates holding her face together. The crime scene unraveled quickly. Missing items, a laptop, credit cards, and Elliott's car. Investigators tracked the credit cards as Nelson used them for shopping sprees. He sold the stolen laptop for quick cash. Blood on his shoes tied him to both victims. Fingerprints and DNA at the church nailed his presence. His probation officer flagged him as suspicious when he failed to appear that very day. Forensic threads tightened into a noose. Nelson was arrested. At trial in October 2012, the prosecution portrayed him as a predator who killed for gain, with no remorse and no hesitation. They laid out his record: burglary, car theft, assaults. They introduced a chilling jail incident. Nelson strangled another inmate, Jonathan Holden, to death with a blanket. That act, prosecutors argued, proved he was too dangerous to ever walk outside prison walls again. Nelson took the stand. His story? He claimed he was only the lookout. He said others, friends named Anthony Springs and Claude Jefferson, were the real killers. He admitted stealing property but denied laying a hand on Dobson or Elliott. The problem for Nelson? Both men had alibis. No evidence placed them in the church. The physical evidence pointed only at him. The jury didn't buy it. Verdict: guilty of capital murder and attempted capital murder. Sentence: death. The courtroom itself became a stage for Nelson's volatility. After hearing his sentence, he snapped a fire sprinkler, flooding the room in dark water. It was a gesture that echoed his history: anger, destruction, refusal to accept the script. From that day forward, Nelson joined the long line of Texas death row inmates who fight execution inch by inch through appeals. His lawyers argued ineffective counsel. They said the evidence was circumstantial, that friends could have been involved. Nelson himself continued to insist he wasn't the killer. But every level of court, from the Texas Court of Criminal Appeals to the U.S. Supreme Court, upheld the conviction and sentence. Meanwhile, his case drew attention outside the courtroom. Supporters of the death penalty saw it as textbook justice: a pastor murdered in his own church, an elderly woman nearly beaten to death, an inmate later strangled behind bars. Opponents pointed to Nelson's background: born in 1987 into a home of neglect, left alone as a child, showing fire-setting behavior as young as 3 years old. His mother abandoned him for days at a time. His father was absent. They asked, did society fail him before he failed others? The debate played out in protests, petitions, and vigils outside Huntsville's prison walls. When the date arrived, there would be no special last meal. Texas ended that tradition in 2011 after a notorious case where an inmate ordered a massive feast and refused to eat it. From then on, condemned prisoners ate whatever was on the standard menu. Nelson had visits, including time with his wife. Then came the moment of last words. At 6:50 p.m., strapped to the gurney, IV lines in his arms, Nelson turned to his wife. His voice carried across the chamber: "I will always love you, no matter. Our love is uncontrollable. I'm at peace. I'm ready to be at home. Let's ride, Warden." With that, the warden signaled. The lethal cocktail entered his veins. Witnesses described his body going still within minutes. He was pronounced dead shortly after 7 p.m., the second execution in the U.S. in 2025. Stephen Nelson's case forces hard questions. Was this justice, swift, final, necessary? Or was it another example of a broken childhood that spiraled into inevitable tragedy? For Pastor Dobson's congregation and Judy Elliott's family, the pain was lasting. For Nelson, the state's answer was final, and just 1 day later, another state took its turn. Not Texas this time, but Alabama, and not lethal injection, but a new and controversial method: nitrogen hypoxia. That story belongs to Demetrius Taryn Frazier, and it's where we're headed next. On February 6, 2025, just 1 day after Texas carried out Stephen Nelson's execution, Alabama used a method still debated in courtrooms and medical journals: nitrogen hypoxia. The man strapped to the gurney at Holman Correctional Facility was Demetrius Taryn Frazier, 52 years old, more than 3 decades into a prison career marked by 2 murders, multiple rapes, and a stack of life sentences in 2 different states. His case is a study in brutality, confession, denial, and a final decision to choose a method of execution that many call experimental. The first crime dates back to November 27, 1991, Birmingham, Alabama. Frazier was 19, drifting between jobs, hustling for money, already known to police. That night, he climbed through a window into the apartment of Pauline Brown, a 40-year-old woman who worked hard to support her family. Frazier pulled a gun, demanded cash, and forced Pauline to hand over about $80. Not satisfied, he assaulted her at gunpoint. When she begged for her life, he shot her in the back of the head. Before leaving, he searched her home for more money, ate food from her kitchen, and vanished into the night. The next day, a co-worker, worried she hadn't shown up for work, discovered her body. Pauline left behind daughters and a newborn grandchild. Just months later, on March 8, 1992, Frazier struck again, this time in Detroit, Michigan. His victim, Crystal Kendrick, a 14-year-old runaway. He lured her into an abandoned house. When she tried to escape during an attempted sexual assault, he shot her in the head. Police later tied him to at least 8 other rapes in Michigan. He was eventually caught, and during interrogation in Detroit, he confessed not only to Kendrick's murder, but also to the Alabama killing of Pauline Brown. That confession became the centerpiece of 2 trials in 2 different states. In Michigan, April 1993, jurors found him guilty of felony murder, rape, and robberies. The sentences, multiple life terms without parole. He was already locked away forever. But Alabama wanted its own reckoning. In 1996, he was transported south to face charges for Pauline Brown's murder. The trial was explosive. Frazier hurled accusations of racism at the mostly white jury, cursed at prosecutors, and at one point threw a pen toward the box. None of it helped. The jury voted 10-2 to recommend death. Judge Mike McCormick imposed it, citing the rape-murder combination as one of the most heinous aggravators under Alabama law. From that moment until 2025, Frazier lived in appeals. He claimed his confession had been coerced, that he was misled by detectives into believing Alabama wouldn't pursue him. He argued that execution methods, whether electrocution, lethal injection, or later nitrogen hypoxia, were cruel and unusual. He tried to transfer back to Michigan, where there is no death penalty, to serve out his life sentences there. Every petition, every motion, every plea was denied. Then came 2018, when Alabama became one of the first states to authorize nitrogen hypoxia as an execution option. The idea: replace oxygen with pure nitrogen, causing death by asphyxiation. No needles, no IV drugs, no electric current. Supporters claimed it was fast and painless. Critics said it was untested, experimental, and potentially torturous. When his time came, Frazier elected nitrogen over lethal injection. As his execution date neared, lawyers argued again, citing eyewitness reports from earlier nitrogen executions where inmates convulsed or gasped. They said Alabama had not proved the process was humane. The courts let it proceed. On his last day, Frazier met with his mother, his sister, and his attorneys. For his final meal, he chose Taco Bell, a beefy 5-layer burrito, a chicken chalupa supreme, crunchy beef tacos, chips with dip, and a Mountain Dew. He gave a final statement, apologizing to Pauline Brown's family, acknowledging that her death should never have happened, and addressing the African-American community with a plea for healing. He also told reporters to contact a detective in Michigan, insisting that his confession in the Kendrick case had been false. His final words were short, "Let's go." At 6:10 p.m., he was strapped down. A mask was secured over his face. Nitrogen gas flowed, replacing oxygen. Witnesses reported gasping, chest movements, and then slowing breaths. It lasted longer than many expected, about 26 minutes before he was declared dead at 6:36 p.m. For Alabama, it was the first execution of the year. For the nation, the third of 2025, Demetrius Frazier's case leaves a trail of questions. Did his decision to choose nitrogen highlight flaws in lethal injection or expose new ones in this replacement? Did his apologies signal genuine remorse, or were they too late to matter? And how should history treat a man convicted of 2 murders, suspected of many more crimes, who died in a mask breathing nothing but nitrogen. With Alabama's execution complete, the focus of February shifted east to Florida, where another case, involving a fishing trip turned double murder, pushed the death chamber doors open again. On February 13, 2025, Florida carried out its first execution of the year at Florida State Prison in Rayford. The man strapped to the gurney was James Dennis Ford, age 64, more than a quarter of a century removed from the crime that sealed his fate. He had been on death row since the late 1990s, filing appeal after appeal, but on this night, the process ended with a lethal injection and a final written message. The case that brought him there traces back to April 6, 1997. Punta Gorda, a quiet town on Florida's Gulf Coast. Ford was working at a sod farm alongside Gregory Malnery. That day, Ford invited Gregory, his wife Kimberly, and their toddler daughter Miranda, just 23 months old, to join him on a fishing trip. On the surface, it was a friendly outing. In reality, it was a setup. According to investigators, Ford turned on Gregory first, shooting him in the back of the head. When Gregory collapsed, Ford beat him and slit his throat. Kimberly fought back, managing to protect her daughter by strapping her into the back seat of their truck, but she could not save herself. Ford assaulted her, then shot her dead. After the killings, he fled, leaving the couple's child alone in the truck with her parents' bodies. For 18 hours, Miranda sat strapped in, dehydrated, covered in insect bites, and stained with her mother's blood. When a sod farm employee discovered the scene, the toddler was still alive. She would grow up without parents, her earliest memory scarred by an event she could never fully recall. The community of Punta Gorda was stunned. Gregory and Kimberly were remembered as warm, hardworking, deeply family-oriented. Their deaths left a permanent void, while their daughter became the living reminder of what Ford had taken away. Ford denied everything at first. He claimed he had gone fishing with the Malnerys, but left them alive when he decided to go hunting. But evidence told a different story. Witnesses saw Ford with blood on his hands, face, and clothes. His body carried scratches consistent with a struggle. Most damning, investigators recovered Ford's gun at the scene. Forensic analysis confirmed it had fired the fatal shots. DNA tests sealed the connection. By 1999, Ford was in trial for 2 counts of first-degree murder, plus charges of sexual assault and related crimes. His defense attorneys tried to reframe the picture. They pointed to Ford's background: an alcoholic father, a mother who abandoned the family when he was a teenager, and a life spiraling after his father's death. They described his heavy drinking, sometimes 24 beers a day, and argued that his mental development was closer to that of an adolescent than a grown man. They pleaded for mercy, for life without parole. The prosecution pressed the opposite point: the brutality of the crime, the deliberate way Ford carried it out, and the cruelty of leaving a toddler at the scene. They argued the aggravating factors were overwhelming. The jury agreed. Ford was convicted on all counts. The judge imposed the death penalty, citing the murder of Gregory and Kimberly in front of their child as an especially cruel element. Over the next 25 years, Ford's case wound its way through Florida's appellate system, federal habeas petitions, and emergency filings. His attorneys consistently argued his mental health should spare him from execution. They insisted he was impaired, incapable of fully understanding his actions. Each time, courts upheld the original sentence. When the end drew near, Ford was permitted visits from 3 family members. He ordered a last meal that leaned Southern and hearty: steak, macaroni and cheese, fried okra, sweet potato, pumpkin pie, and sweet tea. Unlike many others, Ford chose not to deliver spoken last words from the gurney. Instead, he wrote a brief message, leaving it for officials to share after his death. Hugs, prayers, love, God bless everyone. At 6:19 p.m. Eastern Time, the warden gave the signal. The drugs flowed into Ford's veins. Witnesses described a calm process: eyes closed, chest rising and falling, then slowing to stillness. The execution was pronounced complete. For the Malnery family, it was the close of a nearly 3-decade wait. For Miranda, the daughter who survived, it was another reminder of the parents she lost before she could form memories of them. For Ford, it was the end of a life marked by addiction, violence, and a crime that shocked a small Florida town, and Florida's chamber would not be the only one active that night. Hours later, in Texas, another case reached its conclusion, this one involving revenge, nightclub rivalries, teenage victims, and a defendant who once threatened a state senator from behind bars. The name was Richard Tabler, and his story became the fifth execution in the United States in just the first 6 weeks of 2025. On the very same night Florida carried out the execution of James Dennis Ford, Texas brought its own case to a close. At the Huntsville unit, on February 13, 2025, prison officials administered a lethal injection to Richard Lee Tabler, 46 years old, just 8 days past his birthday. His name had circulated for 2 decades, not only for the crimes that put him on death row, but also for the chaos he created behind bars, threatening politicians, smuggling cell phones, and living in a way that made even the prison system uneasy. Tabler's life began in California in 1979, inside a fractured home. His father drank heavily, his parents fought constantly, and by age 10, his mother had left. He bounced between households, never rooted, never steady. At school, he repeated grades, struggled with learning difficulties, and carried an ADHD diagnosis that seemed to explain his quick temper. As an adult, he collected arrests, burglary, escape, assaulting a police officer. At one point, he even slipped out of a patrol car and threatened his parole officer. Trouble was a constant. By 2004, Tabler had drifted to Killeen, Texas, finding work at a nightclub. That year, resentment began to build. He clashed with the club's manager, Muhammad Amin Ramani, who had fired him. Tabler claimed Ramani had threatened his family. Whether that was true or not, he decided to get revenge. On November 26, 2004, over Thanksgiving weekend, Tabler called Ramani, pretending to offer stereo equipment for sale. Ramani showed up with a friend, Hayam Frank Zeta, to meet him in a parking lot. Waiting there were Tabler and an 18-year-old soldier, Timothy Payne. Gunfire erupted. Zeta was shot, Ramani was dragged from the car and finished off with a bullet to the head. Tabler and Payne stole belongings from the vehicle. Payne even recorded part of the encounter on video. 2 days later, Tabler struck again. He lured Amanda Benfield, 16, and Tiffany Dodson, 18, both dancers at the same club, with promises of drugs. He drove them to a remote lake and executed them. His reasoning, later explained, he believed the teenagers had talked to police about the earlier killings. Their bodies were discovered days later, one identified quickly, the other only after being matched to missing person records from Louisiana. The spree ended when Tabler was arrested for unrelated felony theft on the same day he killed the girls. While in custody, he confessed to all 4 murders. He also named Payne as his partner in the Ramani Zeta killings. Prosecutors had everything they needed: confessions, eyewitnesses, and physical evidence. Payne was arrested separately and later convicted, receiving a life sentence with parole eligibility after 40 years. Tabler was charged with 4 counts of capital murder. His first trial, in March 2007, focused on the deaths of Ramani and Zeta. It moved fast. The jury returned guilty verdicts. On April 2, 2007, the judge sentenced him to death. Though still facing charges for Benfield and Dodson, the state did not pursue separate trials after securing the ultimate penalty. Death row did not quiet Tabler. In 2008, investigators discovered he had smuggled a cell phone into his cell at the Polunsky unit. From inside, he called and threatened a Texas state senator, sent threatening letters, and even enlisted a prison chaplain to help distribute his messages. His mother was arrested for her role in helping him get the phone. For this, Tabler received an additional 10-year sentence on top of his death sentence. Over time, though, his behavior shifted. Family members said he turned toward religion, began writing books and sketching artwork, even raising a baby lizard in his cell. He corresponded with people on the outside, eventually marrying a woman he met through a prison pen pal program. Supporters claimed he had changed. Prosecutors and victims' families saw it as too little, too late. Tabler's appeals followed the same track as others: ineffective counsel. Mental health concerns, claims that his violent upbringing and ADHD diagnosis should mitigate his punishment. Each was denied. He often wavered on whether to continue fighting or accept execution, sometimes instructing his attorneys to drop appeals, then reversing himself. By 2025, the end was inevitable. Unlike some states, Texas had already abolished the practice of special last meals. Tabor ate whatever was served to inmates that day. When it came time for final words, he delivered them calmly. He expressed regret for his crimes, thanked prison officers for treating him humanely, and spoke to his family, thanking them for their support through years of chaos. At 6:38 p.m., the drugs took effect. Witnesses said his body relaxed quickly, his eyes closing as his breathing slowed. Minutes later, he was pronounced dead. For families of the 4 victims, justice was delayed but not denied. For Texas, it was the second execution in just over a week. For the nation, Tabor's story was another reminder that death row doesn't always end with silence. It can echo with threats, appeals, confessions, and even artwork, right up to the end. By the close of mid-February 2025, 5 executions had been carried out across the United States in just 6 weeks. Each told a different story. Each raised different questions, and together they set the stage for broader reflections on what capital punishment means in this country right now. By mid-February 2025, the United States had already carried out 5 executions in just 6 weeks. 5 names, 5 different stories in 4 different states. For some, those weeks represented justice finally delivered after decades of appeals. For others, they represented the flaws of a system that uses the ultimate punishment unevenly, often after years of uncertainty. Looking at them together gives us a picture that's larger than any single case. It's a snapshot of how the death penalty functions in America right now. Start with the methods. In that short span, the nation saw lethal injections in South Carolina, Texas, and Florida, alongside nitrogen hypoxia in Alabama. Each method carries its own debate. Lethal injection has been the dominant approach for decades, but shortages of drugs and questions about botched executions have pushed states to test alternatives. Alabama's nitrogen execution of Demetrius Frazier was only the second time the method had been used in U.S. history. Witnesses described gasping and a slow death, even as officials insisted it was humane. South Carolina, meanwhile, has struggled to obtain drugs for lethal injection in recent years, turning at times to the electric chair and even approving a firing squad as a legal option. In 2025, they managed to carry out their execution by injection, but the larger fight over methods is far from settled. Then, look at the patterns of background. All 5 men executed in January and February 2025 came from fractured homes, difficult childhoods, or both. Bowman grew up in a family plagued by alcoholism and started drinking before middle school. Nelson was abandoned for days at a time as a child, showing signs of trauma before he could spell his own name. Frazier was sneaking out and breaking laws as a teenager, bouncing between juvenile facilities before committing murder at 19. Ford lost his mother to abandonment, his father to alcohol, and turned to heavy drinking himself. Tabler was diagnosed with ADHD as a boy, struggled with school, and bounced between households. These histories don't excuse what came later, but they show a pattern that repeats. Childhood instability often precedes adult violence. Another theme, the length of time between crime and execution. For Bowman, it was 23 years. For Nelson, 13. For Frazier, 32 years from his first crime and nearly 3 decades on Alabama's docket. For Ford, 28 years after his fishing trip murders. For Tabler, just over 20 years after his nightclub revenge killings. Supporters of the death penalty argue these decades of appeals are evidence of due process, that no one is rushed, that every claim is heard. Opponents argue that waiting decades blunts any sense of closure for victims' families, while leaving condemned prisoners in a state of limbo that critics call cruel in itself. The role of victims' families also surfaced in different ways. Candy Martin's family heard Bowman deny guilt until his last breath. Pastor Clint Dobson's congregation saw Nelson executed, while Judy Elliott, his surviving victim, lived with injuries for the rest of her life. Pauline Brown's family sat through years of appeals while Frazier tried to argue his confession away. The Mallory family watched as Miranda, the toddler who survived, grew up without her parents and carried the legacy of Ford's violence. The families of Ramuni, Zeta, Benfield, and Dodson saw Tabler confess, threaten, repent, and ultimately die by injection. For each family, the question is the same. Did the execution bring closure, or did it reopen wounds that never really closed? Execution rituals tell their own story. Last meals ranged from shrimp and fried chicken to Taco Bell, from steak and sweet tea to standard prison trays. Last words ranged from lengthy proclamations of innocence to short apologies, romantic messages, or silence. Bowman released poems. Nelson told his wife, "Let's ride, Warden." Frazier said, "Let's go." Ford wrote, "Hugs, prayers, love, God bless everyone." Tabler expressed regret and thanks. Each choice reveals something about how a person wants to be remembered, whether defiant, apologetic, or resigned. Beyond individual lives, these 5 executions show the public divide over capital punishment. Outside prison gates in Texas and Alabama, protests gathered, some holding candles, others holding signs calling for justice. Religious groups prayed for mercy. Advocates for victims demanded accountability. Polls continue to show Americans split, with support for the death penalty stronger in some states than others. Yet, in practice, executions remain concentrated. Just a handful of states carry out the vast majority. The first 6 weeks of 2025 demonstrated that the death penalty is not fading quietly. Instead, it continues to operate in bursts. When states secure the drugs, when courts clear the last appeal, when governors deny clemency. Each case brings the same machinery to life: a courtroom, a jury, an appellate pipeline, a gurney, a witness room. Each case also revives the same debate. Is this justice, or is it a ritual of revenge dressed in legal robes? What these executions prove, above all, is that America's death penalty is still very much alive. Different states, different methods, different defendants, but the same ultimate end. And with 5 cases so close together, the country was reminded that capital punishment is not an abstract debate. It is a process that begins with a crime scene and ends in a death chamber. From here, the reflection deepens. Beyond methods, beyond rituals, beyond state politics, the question becomes psychological and cultural. What does it mean when a society listens to the last words of its condemned? Why do we obsess over final meals and final statements? And what does it reveal about us that we want to know every detail of those last hours? When the curtain falls on an execution, the focus often shifts away from the courtroom facts and legal rulings to something more human, more symbolic. What drives our fascination with last meals, last words, and final minutes? Why do we watch, debate, and record these details with the same intensity as the crimes themselves? To understand the executions of early 2025, Bowman, Nelson, Frazier, Ford, and Tabler, we need to step into the psychological and social space where punishment meets ritual. Start with last meals. Across cultures, food is memory, comfort, and ritual. In prisons, it becomes one of the only choices left to the condemned. Bowman ordered a feast: shrimp, fish, oysters, chicken wings, banana pudding, German chocolate cake. Frazier picked fast food: Taco Bell burritos, chalupas, and a Mountain Dew. Ford went Southern: steak, fried okra, pumpkin pie, sweet tea. Nelson and Tabler ate standard trays because Texas had abolished special requests. On paper, these are just menus, but psychologically, they're messages. A spread of seafood and sweets can be a statement of control. If this is my last, I'll take everything. Fast food can be nostalgia, a taste of youth. A simple meal can say, none of this matters. The state frames the gesture as humane, a courtesy. To outsiders, it becomes a point of obsession. News outlets list it, readers debate it, and in some way, society consumes it alongside the inmate. Then, last words. Humans are wired to listen for final statements. They're seen as truth-telling moments, as if facing death strips away all performance. Yet the cases show the variety. Bowman claimed innocence in writing, even as evidence stacked against him. Nelson turned to his wife, romantic to the end. "Let's ride, Warden." Frazier apologized, then inserted doubt about one of his confessions. Ford skipped spoken words, leaving a written blessing. Tabler voiced remorse and thanks. These aren't just personal. They become cultural artifacts. They're printed in newspapers, repeated on broadcasts, debated in forums. They shape the legacy of the executed more than their appeals ever could. A phrase like "let's go" or "God bless everyone" echoes because it compresses a lifetime into a soundbite. Why does the public latch on? Partly, it's the psychology of closure. Victims' families listen, hoping for apology, explanation, or remorse. Sometimes they get it, often they don't. The public, meanwhile, treats last words as a lens into the soul. Was the killer defiant, broken, changed? The ritual isn't only about the condemned. It's about everyone watching, measuring what justice looks like at the edge of death. There's also the social hunger for narrative arcs. True crime has become a genre because people crave stories with beginnings, middles, and ends. Executions provide that arc with brutal finality. The crime begins the story. The trial and appeal stretch the middle. The execution provides the end, a conclusion that life sentences don't offer. Yet, unlike fiction, these endings don't resolve cleanly. They leave survivors with holes that never close, and viewers with questions about fairness, cruelty, and meaning. Psychologists studying capital punishment often point to cognitive dissonance. We say executions are about justice, but we dramatize them with rituals, food, words, witness rooms that make them resemble theater. The state wants efficiency and authority. The public wants symbolism and emotion. That tension fuels the fascination. It's why newspaper articles rarely lead with the chemical names in the injection, but always include the last sentence spoken by the inmate. There's also the broader cultural divide. In some communities, the death penalty is framed as righteous justice, biblical, deserved, necessary. In others, it's seen as barbaric, state-sanctioned killing that mirrors the crime it punishes. The 5 executions of early 2025 highlight that split. Outside the prisons, demonstrators held both candles and banners. Inside, prison staff followed strict protocols. In the middle were the families, some watching in silence, some breaking down, some leaving unsatisfied. And then there's the myth of redemption. Stories about condemned prisoners often highlight transformations, religion embraced, art created, poetry written, apologies made. Tabler raised a lizard, wrote books, and spoke of change. Bowman published poems. Frazier voiced regret. These gestures clash with the permanence of their sentences. Do they matter? For families of victims, often not. For opponents of the death penalty, they serve as evidence that people can change, even after unimaginable crimes. For society, they complicate the question. Are we executing monsters or people who became something else while waiting for death? Finally, executions expose how much of justice is about ritual reassurance. The state doesn't simply kill, it does so by process. A last meal, a last statement, a scheduled time, an official pronouncement of death. It tells society this was not murder, this was justice. The ritual is designed to separate what happened in the crime from what happens in the chamber. But to witnesses and to a broader public, that line can blur. Watching a person strapped down, hearing them speak final words, and seeing their body go still, inevitably forces reflection. Does this execution heal, or does it only create another death to carry? By looking at the psychology and the rituals, we see that executions are about more than punishment. They're mirrors, reflecting how society sees crime, justice, mercy, and itself. The cases of Bowman, Nelson, Frazier, Ford, and Tabler prove it. 5 crimes, 5 trials, 5 punishments, but endless questions about what those final meals, last words, and closing breaths really mean. And as we step into the conclusion, we pull all the threads together, the crimes, the rituals, the debates, to ask the only question that matters in the end. Did justice truly arrive in January and February of 2025? Or did those executions leave us with more doubts than answers? 5 executions in the first 6 weeks of 2025. 5 names. 5 very different stories, and one nation still divided over whether capital punishment delivers justice or simply repeats the violence it condemns. We started in South Carolina, where Marion Bowman Jr. went to his death still claiming innocence, leaving behind a book of poems instead of spoken last words. We moved to Texas, where Stephen Nelson murdered a young pastor in a church, nearly beat an elderly secretary to death, killed an inmate behind bars, and finally faced the gurney after declaring love for his wife. From there, we saw Alabama test its controversial new method, nitrogen hypoxia, on Demetrius Frazier, a man tied to murders in 2 states, multiple rapes, and decades of appeals, who ended with an apology and the words, "Let's go." Florida's turn came with James Dennis Ford, whose crime left a toddler orphaned after a fishing trip turned double murder. His written farewell, hugs, prayers, love, God bless everyone, was simple, but the loss he caused was incalculable. And finally, back in Texas, Richard Tabler, nightclub employee turned spree killer, prison troublemaker, and eventual pen pal husband, ended his story with regret and gratitude before the state injected him at Huntsville. 5 executions, 5 case files closed. But did they close the wounds of the victims' families? Did they close the debate for the public? Or did they leave new scars? One theme cut across every case: time. Decades passed between crime and punishment. For victims' families, that wait can feel like justice delayed. For critics, it proves the system is drawn out, costly, and flawed. Another theme: background shaped by trauma, neglect, abuse, addiction, fractured homes. Again, it doesn't excuse the crimes, but it raises the question of whether society sees the warning signs too late after the damage is already done. The rituals gave us snapshots of humanity at the very edge. Last meals that told stories of comfort, indulgence, or nothing at all. Last words that ranged from love to denial, apology to silence. These details are more than curiosity. They're how we measure the line between justice and vengeance. They're the human pieces left after years of legal arguments are stripped away. So what do these stories say about the United States in 2025? They say capital punishment is alive, but not uniform. They say the methods are changing. Electric chairs and firing squads written into law, nitrogen entering the arena, lethal injection still the default. They say the debate is far from over. Each case becomes fuel for both sides. One side calling it closure, deterrence, justice served. The other calling it cruelty, spectacle, and proof of a broken system. And now it's your turn. Where do you stand? Did justice arrive for Candy Martin's family, for Pastor Dobson's congregation, for Pauline Brown's daughters, for Miranda Malnery, for the families of Ramuni, Zeta, Benfield, and Dodson? Or do these executions leave you with more questions than answers? Drop your thoughts in the comments. Tell us where you're watching from. Which story struck you hardest? The house fire, the church, the abandoned apartment, the fishing trip, or the nightclub revenge? Which last words will stay with you? Bowman's poems, Nelson's Let's Ride, Warden, Frazier's Let's Go, Ford's written blessing, or Tabler's final regret? Before you go, remember this. Every execution isn't just about one inmate. It's about a community, a state, a nation, deciding what justice looks like when the stakes are life and death. The 5 cases of January and February 2025 are reminders that the debate is never just legal. It's moral, cultural, and deeply personal. If you found this deep dive valuable, hit the like button. Share this video so more people can join the conversation. And subscribe to The Final Sentence to follow every case, every execution, and every question that comes with them. Because the story doesn't end here, new trials, new appeals, and new death warrants are always being written. This has been the first chapter of 2025's executions. The final question is yours. Do these cases prove justice was served, or do they leave us wondering whether justice can ever be final?